It seems like just yesterday we were finishing up Unit 1 and now we're in Unit 2. Oh, wait, that was last week. All right, we're going to start off Unit 2 with biodiversity, which is going to be a large theme throughout not only this unit, but we're going to touch back on it multiple times throughout the year. So before we get into biodiversity and its definition, we need to remember what a species is. So if you've already had freshman bio, you've gone through this. If you haven't, we're about to talk about it now. A species is a group of organisms that oftentimes has similar characteristics and can interbreed, meaning they can have babies with each other, that are fertile. Fertile meaning they are capable of having babies. So all of the images you see here are different species of beetle. There are an estimated like 400,000 known species of beetles, and that's just one estimate. It could be much higher depending on which scientist you're talking to and how they're doing the estimate. Each of these different little beasties right here is capable of reproducing with other members of the same species and producing a sustainable population that can last. So let's take a quick look. Do these guys look like they're part of the same species? They may not look very similar, but they are because they're capable of producing these little guys, which are their chickies, and their chicks can grow up and then be fertile with other chicks of the same species. So this is a peacock and a peahen. They look very different because the males are colorful and bright to attract the females who are very picky and like the males with very fancy feathers. But they are members of the same species even though they look very different. Are these guys the same species? This is a tiger and a lion. They're both big cats. They are actually capable of reproducing with each other. So this chunky guy right here is a liger, which is a lion daddy and a tiger mama having a baby. But ligers themselves are not able to reproduce well with lions, tigers, or other ligers. So they're not capable of maintaining a species. So that's why we say that lions and tigers are separate species from each other. And what's the point of all this? Well, biodiversity is often measured in the number of species you have living in an area. It includes multiple things, including genetic diversity, species diversity, and habitat diversity. And the most diverse biomes on the planet are on the land, tropical rainforest. What you see here is an image of just some of the species that exist in tropical rainforests. Honestly, some scientists did a study where they took a single tree in a tropical rainforest. They put like insect spray on it and counted all the species of beetles that fell out of one tree, and they had thousands of them. So we don't even know the total number of species that are found in the tropical rainforest, because every time some scientist goes exploring for new species, they just keep finding more. And similarly, in the water, the most biodiverse areas are going to tend to be in the coral reef. They're very productive ecosystems. They've got plenty of light. They're shallow, so they've got lots of oxygen and carbon dioxide dissolved. They've got plenty of nutrients, and so there's a ton of different species living there. So what does genetic diversity have to do with this? You may have thought, oh, I'm done with bio. I don't have to think about genes. Not quite. So when you have organisms that are genetically diverse, meaning they're not all exactly the same, they're not all similar to each other. They look different, their bodies react different, they respond to diseases differently, then they are better able to respond to stresses in the environment. And even without humans mucking about in things, because humans messing with ecosystems is going to be a common theme, even just in nature, there's always going to be stress. There might be a year where you've got some flooding. There might be a year when you have drought. There might be a year with extra warm temperatures, another year with extra cold temperatures. And if every organism in the environment is genetically identical, you'll start running into problems because let's say you have bananas. So these are two different varieties of bananas. The ones on the left are called Gros Michel, and these are the bananas that were mostly produced and exported and eaten throughout the world about like 60, 70 years ago in the earlier 1900s. However, the problem with them is these guys were all genetically pretty much identical. they were very, very similar. And unfortunately, if there's an organism out there, there's a disease that infects it. So there was an infectious fungus that was able to easily infect one Gros Michel banana plant. And since they were all genetically identical, none of them had some sort of genetic difference that gave them an advantage and ability to defeat that fungus. So very large amounts of the Gros Michel population died. Because of that, farmers and agriculturalists had to pick a different variety of banana to start growing and selling. So they picked the Cavendish, which is what you see on the right. And the Cavendish is genetically different enough from the Gros Michel that it's not vulnerable to that exact same fungus. However, once again, we made a boo-boo. All of these guys are pretty much genetically similar to each other. One Cavendish banana is probably going to have pretty much the same exact genome as the next Cavendish banana, whether you buy that banana in the United Kingdom or here in Dallas. They're all genetically the same. And unfortunately, there are other diseases out there. In fact, there's another variety of the same fungus that took out the Gros Michel that's starting to attack Cavendishes. So what we haven't learned is that if we want to have a resilient, survivable banana crop, we need genetic diversity. And genetic diversity is important in natural populations too. So for example, Florida panthers, back in like the early 1990s, their population went down to about 50 cats in the wild. They have very low genetic diversity. What causes these decreases in genetic diversity? Well, one really big thing that can do that is what's called a population bottleneck or a bottleneck event. So it's some event, something that dramatically reduces the population of a species in a fairly short amount of time. It could be something environmental, so you could have a flood that comes in and wipes out a large chunk of the species, a volcanic eruption, or it could be something caused by humans, hunting, us destroying their habitat, and when that happens, you lose a large chunk of the genetic diversity and you kill off a lot of the carriers of different genetic traits. So let's say that this bottle that you see here is representing our population of whatever organisms we're looking at. And each of the different colors represents a different trait or a different version of the same trait. If we're talking bananas, it could be like the size of the banana itself. It could be the size of the seeds in them. It could be the time it takes the plant to grow from a seedling. But each of those colors represents a different version of the trait, or if you've already had biology, a different allele. Notice we have 3 colors, that's 3 different versions of the trait, and they all seem to be kind of mixed in equally. Now, if something happens and it decreases the population, it's kind of like trying to roll a bunch of marbles out of a bottle with a thin neck. Very few of them are going to make it out. So you have a bottleneck event. It decreases the size of the population, and notice our surviving population is different from the original population. Our original population had a lot of those yellow marbles or a lot of those yellow variations of a trait, and now our surviving population has very few. Well, mutations cause genetic diversity, and mutations happen by accident. So it is extremely unlikely that you're going to get a mutation that's going to reproduce that yellow trait. So the surviving population is going to give rise to a new population with different genetic diversity. Notice the new population is less diverse. Instead of having pretty equal mixes of all 3 colors, now you've got a lot of the red and green varieties of the trait, very few of the yellow. That can be a problem because what if that yellow variety gave you resistance to a disease? And if that yellow variety was wiped out, that disease happened to come along, very few members of this population will survive. It'll be harder for the ecosystem or the species to recover. Similarly, it's important to have a large number of species living in an area. When you have an ecosystem that's very diverse, lots of producers, lots of primary consumers, etc., then it's going to be easy for it to recover from any sort of disruption or problem. That is because the different species might have different ranges of tolerance or different conditions that they can survive. So let's look at this top example that I have here. I have a diverse community, and I'm looking from the left to the right, and from the left to the right, I've got year one, I've got an average climate. Okay, it's just the general normal climate for that area. If I look in year two, which is this middle diagram, notice I had a warm year. Well, it seems like species green, the green species, is better able to survive in warmer temperatures, and so its population might grow. The population of the blue species might shrink because it's less adapted to warmer temperatures, but it still exists. Then, let's say the next year there was a cold snap. There was a bunch of colder weather instead, and now that cold tolerant blue species reproduces a bunch, and you're still able to have multiple species survive. You'll still have the same diversity of species, and you've got these different species that can adapt to different conditions. Sorry, the cat has decided to tell you things too. Yes, I know biodiversity is important. Now, let's say that we had a community that had pretty much only blue species. Those guys, remember, were cold tolerant. They were not heat tolerant. So in the warm year, year two, very few of them survive, or much fewer of them survive. And so even though the next year they were able to kind of replenish their numbers a little more, notice there aren't as many organisms now. So we're going to have a smaller population. Anything that was relying on them as a food source is also probably going to have a smaller population. And let's say it just keeps getting warmer and warmer. If it keeps getting warmer and warmer, those cold tolerant species are just going to die out. You run into the same problem if you have the heat tolerant species that are the only ones in the area. When it warms up, yeah, they're able to reproduce like crazy and spread, but then in a cold year, there are going to be less of them because they're not able to survive as easily in the cold. And hey, they might be able to recover from that population decrease, but what if it keeps getting colder? What if the cold means that they're more likely to succumb to a disease? It's very difficult to support a food web and a food chain if you are losing species. Think about it. If you are losing like half your producers, you're going to lose a lot of primary consumers. If you lose half your primary consumers, you're going to lose a lot of your secondary consumers. And keep in mind, there are fewer and fewer organisms as you go up the trophic level. So losing half of like your tertiary consumers could be going from a population of 5 down to a population of 2. Then it's also important to have diversity in habitats. What this means, habitat diversity has to do with more how many different ecological niches do you have, and this is especially important when you think about the variety of producers. So an ecosystem that has more producers in it will tend to have more habitat diversity than another one. So for example, forests tend to have higher habitat diversity. They have multiple species of trees, bushes, maybe some smaller plants. They might have moss, they might have lichen. Then say deserts, since they have reduced amount of water available, will probably have less producer species there. And this is important because if you lose some of that habitat, you're going to lose some of your specialist species, which are the species that have a very specific niche. They are able to survive off of one food, or they're able to live in one habitat, and losing that wipes them out. It'd be like if all the bamboo in China went extinct. Those pandas would starve. They don't eat anything but bamboo. And then as you start losing more habitat diversity, you can start losing more generalist species, or species that are adapted to wider conditions. So the loss of all the bamboo in China may not affect humans on as large a scale, but if you start losing more habitat and more producers, eventually you might get to the point where humans as a species start being impacted by that loss of species diversity. It can also have an impact on some species that need to have a large territory. So let's say we have this nice green environment here, and the outlined areas represent the size of territory you have to support one organism of a particular species. So we're going to say that this guy right here is going to be species A, here's going to be species B. Let's say then humans move in and they wipe out half of that ecosystem, half of that native area. Now species B is no longer able to survive in that area because it's a type of organism that needs a very wide range. If you think about examples, Tigers, for example, are very solitary and they need to have large territories. They are upper level carnivores, which means that they're going to be needing a lot of prey animals. So they have a very large territory they range over. You start destroying their habitat and there are going to be less tigers. On the other hand, you might have like pigeons. Pigeons don't need a super large territory. That's why you can have a lot of them survive in a dense habitat like a city. So if you start wiping out, say, half of Dallas, not that I'm saying that we should do that, but if you wipe out half of Dallas, the pigeons will be fine. Pigeons can survive on a much smaller territory. Now let's get to some measurements. We're not going to do a ton of math with this, and you shouldn't be asked to calculate anything like this on the AP test, but it is good to know about species richness, and then we're also going to talk about species evenness. So the species richness is the number of different species you can find in an ecosystem. If we look at ecosystem A, let's count how many different species we see. So I see this type of tree, this type of tree, this type of tree, and this type of tree. And those look like the only 4 species of tree that are there. So there are 4 species of tree. That would be our species richness. If some of those species, like let's say all of these guys died, our species richness would decrease. Let's say we had some cacti move in. Well, if some cacti moved in, that would increase our species richness because we would be adding more species. This is different from something called species evenness, which is how evenly spread out are these species. If we look in community A, what we'll see is that, sorry, gotta erase. If we look at species A, what you'll notice, not species, community A, you'll notice that there's about 5 of each of those trees. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. There's an equal number of each species of tree, meaning there's an even spread of species. Let's look at community B though. Community B is mostly this species. It's got the same species richness because we have the same 4 different types of trees. Wait, I lost one. There it is. But notice that for 3 of those tree species, we only have 1 example of each, one of each of those species living there. Most of them are this other kind of like bushy looking tree. If something happens, like some sort of disease comes through that starts killing these bushy looking trees, you're going to devastate that ecosystem because you're going to lose most of the producers. Whereas if you have something in community A that starts knocking out the bushy trees, well, there are still other trees, many other producers that consumers could eat if they're not like super picky. Sorry, my pickiness example is pandas. I pick on them because they're picky. Now, you can measure both the species richness and the species evenness with what's called a diversity index. And I know I have here the term indices. Indices is the plural of index. So there are a couple of different ways to measure this. We're going to try out one in class. But like I said, you shouldn't have to do this math on the AP test, and we will try to make it less math heavy in our lesson in class as well. So this is a way to measure with a number the biodiversity so that you can compare different ecosystems without having to say, well, I've got 5 plants in this ecosystem and I've got like 3 producers in this like aquatic ecosystem. How do I know who's got more biodiversity? Well, this is a way you can measure it quantitatively, meaning with numbers. All right, that is about it. I hope you enjoy that lovely Bitmoji of me frolicking with slightly biodiverse ecosystem. And we'll be back for our next lesson soon enough.